Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And if you're a regular at a Tortoise Thinking, you'll know that in honor of tonight's subject, Netflix, we rebranded in Netflix Red, appropriated their Netflix audio ident. But that's where I suppose the indulgence will end, because since we set up Tortoise and we got going in the spring, in April 2019, this question about the responsibility of platforms and the way in which new tech is changing the conversation in the public square, not just in the US, but around the world, has been, if you like, one of the thematic issues that concerns us, partly because we were set up in response to the noise, and partly because we were set up in response to the power gap. And in both senses, the reality is that the platforms, and often we talk about Facebook or Google or others, but Netflix in particular has a place in the life of the mind, not just of its 220 million odd subscribers, but the culture of countries around the world. And so tonight's thinking is, suppose, a question, but in search of a much bigger answer. Does Netflix have a political agenda? And I hope that between the four people that we brought together who really have a depth of expertise, if not a complete coincidence of opinions, have a depth of expertise, will help us first get at what the truth is of what that political agenda might be, then try and understand what of that matters, what of that's important. And I hope that some way along the way in the second half of this thinking, we might think a little bit about what should be done. How do you step into that in a way that's not heavy-handed in regulation, but tries to think about the overall impacts on audiences everywhere? I said to Gina Keating just before we got started, who's the author of Netflix, who probably, I was going to say, probably knows more about this subject than even the most, binge-watching Netflix lovers could possibly wish to. I was saying to Gina before we start that I come at this with a certain prejudice, which is, before I worked at Tortoise, my last job was at the BBC. And the BBC, as you all know, has its centenary this year, founded in 1922, on a basic understanding that television, or as it was then radio, the power of broadcast would have an exceptional impact on the life of the mind of citizens. And as a result, people had to be extremely careful. It had to have high public standards. John Reith talked about the BBC giving the best of everything to everyone. But from its beginning, there was a license fee, not as a means of paying, but as a means of controlling, as a means of regulating the output of the BBC, so that it was accurate, fair, responsible, and impartial. And while that's not a requirement of streamers, there is a question about the extent to which its enormous power on the life of the minds of its audience is in any way mediated by politics or the public. And that's what we're going to try and get at this evening. So I'm going to, in turn, introduce you to Lucas Shaw, who's joined us, to Michael Flaherty, and to Karen McNally. But I'm going to start with Gina, if I might. Gina, I think the title of the book is Netflix, the Epic Battle for America's Eyeballs. I realize, of course, that actually it's now the world's eyeballs. Tell us what the truth is, in your view, to the answer to our question. Does Netflix have a political agenda?
I would say that more than a political agenda, they operate in a very utilitarian way that tracks the ambitions of the guys who founded it. And those three guys, in my opinion, who have had the most influence over Netflix are Mark Randolph, Reed Hastings, who now runs it, and Ted Sarandos, who did most of the content selection. And the funny thing about this is Mark Randolph is actually related to both Sigmund Freud and Edward Bernays, who is considered the father of modern public relations in the United States. He did stuff like work with American Tobacco Company to make it okay for women to smoke, because used to you couldn't. He did a lot of propaganda campaigns with the U.S. government, a lot of wartime stuff. Reed Hastings had a couple of forays into politics before Netflix started. And also the funny thing about him is he joined the Marines and the Peace Corps. So that's kind of interesting if you think about it. He started, after he sold his first company, which was called Pure Atria, he started a lobby group for the tech industry in Silicon Valley called TechNet. And the purpose of that was to get people, shareholders to stop suing tech companies, B, to get more high-tech visas for immigrant workers, and then to try to get charter schools passed so that they could hire more American tech people, tech students, because they weren't finding enough people. And in that, he actually managed to piss off both the right and the left, because when he was the head of TechNet, he raised millions of dollars for a lot of Democrats, including Bill Clinton. And then he also passed this charter school initiative, which infuriated the California Teachers Association. So that's the kind of guy that you're dealing with here, is somebody who's very focused on his path. He also was nominated, was actually put on the California Board of Education. And right before he got nominated, he had Netflix pull all the softcore porn titles that they used to rent. And they did that in like 2 days, because he didn't want two things. Number one, he didn't want to be embarrassed about this in his nomination hearings. And second, he didn't want some small town DA, as he and Mark Randolph put it, using Netflix as a political football because they were running behind in an election. So they're very practical. I mean, very ambitious, but also very practical. So they're going to do what serves Netflix, in my opinion.
All right. Well, Gina, I'm going to come back to you in a moment. And by the way, I see some familiar and regular faces. Welcome back to all of you to our Think-Ins. Those of you who've not joined us before, this is basically like an open news meeting. So we want to hear from as many people as possible. You'll see my colleagues have already started making points in the chat. We're going to bring you in. If you've got a thought, don't hold back, and we'll try and hear from as many people as possible in the course of things. But Karen, why don't I come to you? You teach this at London Metropolitan University, or at least study it, try and make sense of it. What's your view in terms of what's true? Does Netflix have an agenda? Oh, sorry, most importantly, we need to hear you. Is that?
Yeah, fine. Yeah.
Okay.
You got me. It's such a broad topic. What Gina is saying makes complete sense to me, and just reflecting on what they have as on their platform and what they seem to be making as original content, I can see that the kind of balancing act that they're trying to do, and it almost disappoints me, really, because I see other content on the networks which you would think would be very safe politically, but in the past few years, when there are things that you can discuss that are, I don't think it's too controversial to critique some of the things that have gone on in the United States in recent years, and they're not happening. I'm thinking more in terms of what would in old money be called TV, dramas and comedies. They're not directly political from my perspective. I see much more critique of the Trump era on networks and also on other streaming like Hulu and Paramount Plus. It's not that streaming companies are not doing this. It just seems to me that Netflix isn't possibly doing it. And that is, so it sounds like they are treading that kind of balancing act and don't want to be seen really as a political company.
That's so okay. That's really interesting. I'm gonna park my prejudice for about 5 minutes longer so we can hear from Michael and Lucas and then unleash. But Michael Flaherty, you make great award-winning shows. I hope that doesn't impede what you think you can say about Netflix. What do you make of this question?
First of all, I noticed in the chat there are a lot of questions about questioning the algorithm. I agree. I think the algorithm is bollocks. I think it's a Potemkin village, but that's a subject for another Think-In. And in terms of politics, I think Netflix is like every studio, and they only see green. And my Gina's book was tremendous because part of the creation myth was they loved telling the story about when the President Clinton hearings were happening with Monica Lewinsky. They realized that they could make copies of DVDs and send them out. Well, it was such a scattershot startup that it got mixed up with Chinese pornography. So all these people in the red states who wanted to see the Bill Clinton hearings accidentally got this Chinese pornography, and Netflix thought, oh my gosh, we're finished. And they got all these phone calls and they said, we apologize, just send the DVD back. And they said, oh, we don't want to send it back. I think we misplaced it. And so, and I'm not nervous, in terms of what I say about Netflix, whether that will, influence whether or not they buy our films or not. However, I am very concerned that, like the rest of Hollywood, they will do what China tells them to do. And it's interesting that you let off with the 100th anniversary of the BBC and having your roots in radio. Because if you remember, one of the great myths is Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast, that it drove people into a panic. I think that there were a total of 5 complaints. Newspapers were losing enormous revenue to this new medium called radio. And the New York Times editorial, I read it the other day, it's almost identical to the criticism of Joe Rogan. And it says, this is a new medium and you need to practice it responsibly and professionally. You can't just, it was very elitist and sort of arrogant. And I think that we're just going through a lot of those similar steps, but whatever their shareholders ask for, they're going to ultimately be the ones running the show.
Okay, Michael, that's great. I want to hear from Lucas too, because Lucas reports on this for Bloomberg, and also has a brilliant blog which gets you sort of, not it's like inside the studio, but at least to the studio steps. Lucas, do you agree broadly that there's not really much politics, there's just business?
I do, although I guess what I would say is Netflix, like a lot of Hollywood companies, has an innate but slight liberal bias or democratic bias, depending on what part of the world, progressive bias, because most of its senior executives tend to identify in a particular political party or with certain leanings, and especially the people who are commissioning programming, I would say, tend to be more towards the left than to the right. So that means that you'll see more topical programming, more comedic programming featuring people who share those points of view. But on the whole, I think Netflix's primary orientation is towards making as much money as possible, towards serving its customers and towards serving its shareholders. They may really like Hassan Minhaj. That doesn't stop them from taking down an episode because the government in Saudi Arabia wants them to. And they need to find programming that appeals to conservatives as well as to liberals. And that's why you see, there have been kind of conversations within Netflix. I've seen them in a kind of internal documents that I actually haven't reported on, but they tend to say the company is aware that it is seen as having a liberal bias. And so it tries to moderate that with its communication and with its output, because it certainly doesn't want to be perceived as favoring anyone, because it's trying to serve everyone.
So Lucas, I'm gonna start to bring in a moment, because I want to hear from people. I know that my colleague Luke Bedham has raised a point about the algorithm, and I see that George Davidson has done too, and I'd like to bring Julie Bush in a moment. I just want to push back, if I can, for one moment on the sort of the drift of things as they are, just because I want to tell you how you see Netflix if you're working in a different regulated environment as a public service broadcaster. So the BBC, and obviously I worked in news, so there was a particular focus on that, but the BBC would look at impartiality as not just a question of left and right, not just a question of Republican and Democrats. there would be a responsibility to local, national, and global. And if you look at what Netflix puts on, that programming overwhelmingly tips towards the global, has some national, largely if you're the US, but mostly no other countries in the world, and absolutely nothing local in terms of a meaningful kind of reflection of what's happening in your society near you. There would be, putting left and right aside, a question about kind of liberal values, or what, if you're a conservative, you might call a woke agenda. And people would definitely see that if, for example, the Netflix output were BBC output, that's what they would say, that there was a particular worldview that had captured commissioning, right? And I think the third thing that people would say is what's significant is not just what you put on, right? So a particular bias towards climate issues, or towards, you know, true crime issues, or towards tech issues, i.e. for a very specific demographic, but also significantly what you don't put on, right? So nothing around live corruption issues, nothing around kind of really big money or finance business issues. There's a world of coverage that doesn't exist in Netflix, and that adds up to an agenda. It's not a straight Democrat Republican agenda, although I think everyone would see that. But if you were a broadcaster in the public service broadcasting world, you'd think that Netflix is operating to a completely different set of rules. And Michael, I just want to pick up your point about the, Joe Rogan comparison with Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds. I wonder whether what I'm saying to you is exactly the same point you're making, which is that I'm essentially a creature from a past age, whinging about the fact that the new tech, essentially gets a free ride on this one, and I want to somehow drag them, into an old world of linear broadcasting. I mean, do you think I should just sort of basically get over it, and essentially there's a new world and things have changed?
No, I would classify you more as a Yoda than a Luddite. I think that there's an arrogance in Silicon Valley that all of the lessons we've learned from media over the last century don't apply, simply because of the delivery mechanism is a bit different. And that's nonsense. There's a lot that they could learn. And I think that it's hurting them, that they're rather ageist in terms of not looking to people who have experience. With the algorithm, I have to laugh, because every shareholder meeting they have, they always say, we're not competing with Disney. We're not competing with Paramount. We're competing with Facebook, and we're competing with Twitter. And sure enough, what do you know? One of their top documentaries last year was The Social Dilemma, which was a 1-hour screed about the fact that if you allowed your kids to have any social media accounts, you were going to permanently destroy their mental health. And it was completely biased. And I thought that was really interesting, that they gave such premier beachfront real estate to a documentary that took down their biggest competitors.
And amazingly, just as a piece of journalistic kind of fair dealing, didn't seem to analyze the impact of its screens on that attention economy. That seemed like an incredible omission. Sorry, Lucas looks like he's about to pop. What were you saying, Lucas? Sorry.
Yeah, well, a couple things. I think you guys are probably overestimating the influence that especially leadership at the top has on the individual programming that's commissioned. I mean, one of the things that you hear most often about Netflix is, both from people inside the company and from outside of it, is because they are producing at such a high volume. I don't think that people are approaching that with a certain agenda. And a lot of projects, to the Rogan example, they're not getting as little oversight as Joe Rogan, but they're not getting a lot of oversight, especially when you're talking about documentaries, maybe by producers that they have some kind of pre-existing relationship with or faith in. One of the kind of the great successes, but also great failings, I'd say, of Netflix as a company is that there's not the same level of oversight over a lot of the programming that they put out that there is at other places, because they're operating at such a scale that there's simply not the ability to do so, or not enough bodies to do so. And it's why you see projects come out that that can feel rushed or feel distended. So I don't think anybody at Reed Hastings was sitting there looking at the social dilemma saying, or looking at what's happening, saying we must have a project that is critical of Facebook. I would say, just to one other point that you made about bias about financial malfeasance, Netflix actually has had one, if not several, documentaries about financial crimes and about kind of corruption and capitalism. I'm sure that there is some sort of institutional bias towards capitalism, but that's not a subject that they've shied away from in any way, shape, or form.
Lucas, sorry, I wasn't trying to say that. I wasn't trying to say, oh, that the show has to be about corruption and capitalism. What I'm saying is about, actually, if you're on the right, you don't necessarily want to see corruption and capitalism. You want to understand the business world and not only see it through a particular lens. That's that mix of kind of coverage I was trying to get to. But can I just make one point, which I just want to understand is, for example, if you make panoramas on the BBC, there's a kind of understanding of a responsibility, and it's also set out in the charter about the different things that you need to do, right? So domestic, agenda setting, popular, foreign, these things. What you're describing in Netflix in terms of commissioning is a whole bunch of people commissioning, but not necessarily with a sense of order about what the purpose is beyond A, quote unquote, entertaining the world, and B, delivering for shareholders. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, well, I'd say on the one hand, to your point about the priorities for Panorama, Netflix has always, or at least in the last decade or so, seen itself as an entertainment company. And so I don't think it is approaching its documentaries with the same priorities as a news organization. Sometimes to its detriment. It's really looking for story first, and stories that it think will entertain people. It would certainly like to, win journalism awards and maybe make a difference, but you note that you can see that their executives are very careful to say that they're not in the news business and don't particularly want to be in the news business, because it invites scrutiny about the news gathering it's doing, and it doesn't want that. It would like to avoid scrutiny for as long as possible. And I do think historically, yes, you're right that a lot of the decision making about programming was made on a more localized level. There were certain priorities, like maybe in the unscripted department right now, there's a big priority to find kind of sport series, sport documentaries, because they've done well and they want to add to that. But it has historically been a culture that empowered people further down to just buy things that they like, take a bunch of chances that are quite different. And based on what succeeds, it will then iterate or pick more shows inspired by that. I don't think that there is always a clear programming mandate, and certainly not company-wide, maybe in individual departments.
I want to, Lucas, thank you. I want to just hear from Gina what you make of this. I'm going to bring in George Davidson and Julie Bush, as I said, and if possible, Sam East-Frizzell. So, Gina, what do you make of this? Is there no point really making a comparison between networks and public service broadcasters and Netflix?
I think that when you want to talk about the ethics of programming, I think that you absolutely have to make a point about it, because they're so incredibly powerful. The way that their programming ethos came about was, they came in when DVD was just starting, and the major studios did not want any of their content to be delivered digitally because they knew that it would be pirated. So there was a tremendous pushback against DVD, and they weren't able to get a lot of titles. They got a lot of old titles, they got foreign films, Bollywood, anime, stuff like that. So they were, their goal was essentially to get people to continue to pay their subscriber fees. And that's when the algorithm arose in 1999, when they were trying to figure out, like, okay, we have this tiny catalog, and it's kind of strange for American audiences. So how do we get people who love romantic comedies to, say, watch Bollywood and keep paying their subscription fees? And so that's kind of like, it was this very piecemeal way of trying to figure out programming. And they were making these connections initially that were pretty surprising and exciting to people who didn't, especially American audiences who didn't have access to foreign films and these other genres that were popular internationally. So it was kind of a weird way to acquire content. Like they were trying to get everything they could, and then they were trying to figure out, you know, how to keep the audience that they had interested. Then they move into trying to buy, you know, do some deals with the studios. And they couldn't do that because they were kind of blocked out by Blockbuster. So they turned to the independent film community in the United States with the idea that someday those filmmakers would be people that they did deals with when they were making content. So they just don't, like, I agree with Lucas, they don't really have a direction. And the thing is they have this immense amount of data on all of us for 25 years that they can use to make these decisions about what to buy. You know, their initial crop of content was informed by the algorithm. And to your point about what their responsibility is, I did a TED Talk in, I think it was like 2019, because I was getting really concerned about the way that the algorithm was recommending things. And it was really siloing people into their own interests. And they do this, that the mechanism for the algorithm is they pick something called nearest neighbor groups. So you're put into a little group with all the people who have liked the same movies that you like. And so you're getting more and more of the content of people that are like you. Now, Mike told me yesterday, I didn't know this because they didn't test it in my area, that they had a shuffle button because of what is called the Napoleon Dynamite problem by the machine learning experts, which is just what I said, is that these communities make it so that some content is just not going to get recommended because they can't figure out who likes it. So content is actually being thrown out because the algorithm can't figure out.
Can't find it.
Yeah.
So I by the way, Jess Moore, I'm going to come to you too, because I think you might have to, unfortunately, have to provide all the answers. We're going to just pile up the problems, then we're going to just go and land them at the very beginning of your PhD process. But I wonder if I can, Gina, thank you for that. I wonder if I can just bring in George Davidson. George, am I right in thinking that you used to work at Netflix? You may have been, we may be talking about what seems like Netflix history, but was actually your life.
It was. It's a long time ago when I worked at Netflix, which is a disadvantage from my perspective. But the advantage is it was in quite the early days. So
when were you there? So what was
2004, 05. So I was in the London office and I flew over to Los Gatos a couple of times. Reed Hastings came over to London and met with us. We had the Americans who came over were kind of the most trusted, a bit like sending Roman consuls out of Rome to found a fortress in North Africa. They were the ones, they were very much dyed in the wool. So I feel like I have the advantage of the perspective from the early days. I'm still friends with many people who were there and worked there for a long time. So I feel like I have a feeling for the organization.
And George, what do you think of this? Because I suppose in terms of the first question we have, which is what's the truth? What's the truth of a political agenda? At this stage, what we seem to be talking about is an accidental political agenda. Gina described it in terms of the people, Michael and Lucas described it a little bit in terms of, the business model, it was clear from Karen that you're talking more about the kind of political culture it's set against, but it wasn't active in that sense. Is that, do you think, fair? Is that true?
I think that's very fair. And I totally agree with what Lucas said, which I'm going to unfairly paraphrase and imply that he said that Reed Hastings was an interesting bunch of guys. I mean, there is this thing about being both of the left and overtly capitalist going on at the same time. So they're very firmly Democrats. There's no doubt about that. I remember in one conversation, Los Gatos expressing a enthusiasm for George W. Bush's policy in sending aid to Africa, because he sent billions of dollars to Africa in aid. And, I could see everyone was not impressed with any praise at all for George W. Bush. And I know they're Democrats, they're predominantly Democrats, but they would not there's no way that would infiltrate into the programming deliberately,
Right.
because they wouldn't want to be seen to have political view, because you want 100% of the population and not 52 or 48. So they wouldn't overtly do that. But
that seems to change, George, doesn't it? I mean, just to say, I mean, I think that the latest figures I saw was a sort of 16% drop in Republican support for Netflix in the last couple of years. Something has clearly shifted. I mean, a lot shifted in the US, but the extent to which Netflix is comfortable with being identified with a political position has changed, hasn't it?
Well, yes, and they commissioned the Obamas.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they've taken a view. I think, leaders cast a shadow for good or ill, and I think whatever their perspective is, that they went, they have commissioned that work, whether they intend it or not, and that they have created this culture. I mean, the other thing that's sort of strangely left and right wing is their very famous, or moderately famous, culture deck, which was in the early stages when I worked there, and pops up every sort of 12 to 18 months on social media, particularly on LinkedIn, which is, here is the culture at Netflix. And in that, there are some quite sort of soft left ideas, like the bottomless holiday. You can take as much or as little vacation as you want while you work here, which is an extraordinary idea for Americans to face, and pretty uncomfortable for Brits to face up to. Like, we're not, just take as much or as little as you want. And but then there's this quite right-wing idea on the 2 slides later in the culture deck that says, we're not a family, we're a sports team, we sign the best people. My head grows a bit. We find the best people and put them in the best positions, and when we don't need you anymore, we cut you, and you're gone, we pay you off with thanks. And I've worked with lots of companies who've said, we're a family, we're really nice, and when push comes to shove, they're not. They're a capitalist organization owned by their shareholders, and they'll cut you, and their values are gone. So Reed and Ted were straight from the get-go. They said, we're not going to pretend we're a family, we're a sports team. So they hold these kind of 2 positions at the same time.
George, that's so interesting. I have to confess, I've always thought that the Netflix position on holiday is about as stress-inducing as a holiday policy can be. Take as much as you like. Really, you really want to take both of those days? But it's like, I find that really stressful. It doesn't feel particularly safe. But it's but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's a much looser place to work than I thought. Karen, I'm going to come back to you in a moment if I can, but I would love to just, Julie Bush, you made a point really early on about just how you see it and how you see the way in which we interact with Netflix. I wondered what this conversation has got you to from here.
How we interact with Netflix, I'm not sure what you mean, sorry.
Just because I suppose I want to see if we can move the conversation not from like what the agenda is to what's important. How much should we worry about an entertainment platform doing different kinds of entertainment and not doing responsible information, a fair kind of even-handed treatment of what's going on in the world? How much that really matters? That's what I meant about how we interact with it. Whether we really know what it is.
Yeah, I think it is ultimately an entertainment business, and it's ultimately a business. And the thing that happened with the Chappelle special, which I didn't actually watch, I have to say, but the critics panned it, and he came out calling himself a TERF, and it was about trans rights and all the rest of it. And in the end, if you looked at Rotten Tomatoes, 33% of critics just, it was panned, but actually 96% of the audience loved it. Yeah. And in the end, Netflix, they didn't pull it, as far as I know. They stood by it, and there was some staff that walked out and blah, blah, blah. But in the end, maybe that's just a business decision. That's it.
Well, I think I might be a bit tough on them, because they are standing by someone who's, their free speech issues, there's, rights of comedy. They seem to be holding their ground on that. I mean, I thought we touched on, I think Lucas touched on the Hassan Minhaj case in Saudi Arabia, which was 2019, where they did pull a program because it offended the Saudis, a joke offended the Saudis. But actually those cases, as far as I know, have been pretty few and far between. I don't know whether you think they were doing the right thing with Dave Chappelle, or recently even with Jimmy Carr.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think, those kind of conversations in any space, whether it's Twitter or wherever it is, are very difficult, and people, it's very polarized and people scream at each other. Maybe if that had been the other way around, the critics loved it and the audience hated it, maybe the response would be different. I don't know. Maybe I'm doing.
Yeah, I guess no. I bet you I think that's a very good point. I bet you that's exactly right. Julie, thank you. The reason I wanted to come back to you, Karen, was actually a point that Julie's taken us to, which is that I don't know whether you saw, but Nadine Dorris, who's the UK's culture secretary and actually doing quite a good job of trying to make London the entertainment capital of the world at the moment, had a point to make about the Jimmy Carr program, which was that the regulators are going to begin to look at the streamers the way in which they do, network television, BBC, ITV, etc. And Karen, I don't know what you think of that, whether you think that's nonsense, they're never going to be able to do that, or that's a good idea, or fill in the blank.
Oh gosh, I mean, it's very tricky because Netflix is obviously, it's streaming to multiple countries, so the regulator where is going to do that? And I mean, I think they have a wider sphere of influence, don't they? As we've been talking about Saudi Arabia, it makes me think of there was an episode of The Good Fight, which was on the CBS streaming service at the time, and there was one episode where there was some kind of criticism of China, which I can't remember exactly what it was, and there was a big battle between the showrunners and then the streaming company, the CBS, whatever it was, and it ended up with a blank screen at a certain point in the episode because they weren't allowed to discuss the subject that they'd wanted to, and it was a China issue. I think these things are getting much more complex. I think it's why they're quite nervous, is obviously the global comes in much more than when you're thinking of something like network television. From the past, even from decades ago, they would, I mean, I was watching the Dick Cavett show, where they had from the 70s, and they went into the Watergate hearing room, and that, that show combined all this politics and movie stars and all of this, and was able to do that very successfully. And I think even the dramas on HBO, from The Sopranos onwards, the whole idea of quality TV really was bound up in the political angle to it as well. That was part of it. So it almost seems to me that a company like Netflix is going a little backwards in not being able to combine all of these things. I mean, it loses out certainly from not being a network, so you can't have live TV and deal with live events and have news shows in the same way. But I think I think of it, if you're trying to be all things to all people, in some ways it becomes a little problematic. I understand what you're talking about with the BBC, but it's a very different thing, isn't it? It's very specific.
Yes, it is, and there's a question of whether or not that just doesn't apply in the world of kind of internet age information entertainment. Karen, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but there are a fair few other people. Jess Moore, upon whose poor PhD thesis it feels as though everyone's hopes now rest. Do you want to just tell us? So, tell us what you're doing,
yeah,
and then how that all fits in.
So I'm a scriptwriter and a playwright originally, and a writer and a director. And I should disclose as well, formally until last March was vice president of corporate social responsibility for Warner Media. So dealt with all of their sustainability and do-gooding and access to the industry for everywhere outside of North America. And yeah, started Glasgow Caledonian offered this PhD to me in looking at how we can use screen drama for social good, and specifically screen drama related to the themes of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I suppose what I'm interested in is, you know, if you look at the best of what documentarians can do in news coverage, we can say, we know we're impacted by stories. We know that for a while we might think more about it. I mean, Emma Jackson was mentioning that episode of Blue Planet that just caused such a change in single-use plastic. What can we learn from that? And what I'm particularly interested in is not only like dramaturgically how a program has an impact, but also how we could actually measure that. So beyond just saying we've raised awareness, could we get to a point where we said, well, this program, the commissioners and the creatives have actually considered the SDGs within it, and we are actually moving towards doing something good, and that is actually measurable. And that sounds very hard, but I am interested.
And just forgive me for being kind of pouring cold water on it. It also sounds like you know, that there's the danger, isn't there, that you then start doing kind of do good TV that no one wants to watch.
Oh God, yeah. And how do you make sure that you don't do good TV that no one wants to watch? And that can be from, you know, do you just consider the SDGs in writing? And I'm a writer, and I wouldn't mind if someone, you know, what I think most writers are very keen at the moment well, I hope they are, to be more aware of progressive thought and where they should be and how they should be phrasing things and being more thoughtful about all of those things. So of course, I think that's the key. No one wants to watch. Well, that's not true, but you know, you've got to, if you're just preaching to the choir, then it's not going to have a wider impact. So how do you create interesting programs that we all want to watch? You know, long-running drama, something funny, something warm, something that feels unchallenging, but still achieve social good. But I'm also interested in leveraging the power of the streamers and frankly the production value of the streamers to do some good. And should we be? It's sort of an open question.
And if you take kind of Lucas's sort of description of Netflix, where essentially there's a whole world of commissioners commissioning different programs, and it's not kind of organized by the numbers, it's certainly not mapped against 17 sustainable development goals. Do you think that there's an answer in there somewhere that actually you'd like to see producers of content at least trying to map their output against some kind of progressive metrics, or is that a little bit Soviet for you?
Yeah, I think that's probably what my PhD is about to find out. I think I think it's incumbent upon all of us. I mean, as I said, I led CSR for a movie studio for years, and I felt I got to the point where I thought with CSR, corporates don't really all need to create their own CSR plans. They could just have a look at the 17 goals and choose which one of those they can contribute to. I don't think there would be any harm in creatives being more aware of what the SDGs are and thinking, you know, is there anything I can contribute towards these? You know, even if it's about gender equality, shall I just make sure that you know, I've considered every role, and do all of these roles need to be men, or could some of them be non-binary characters or female identifying characters? You know, you could take the SDGs in the broader sense and have a look and think, have I done everything I can in terms of my carbon footprint? Have I considered the context of this, how this will be considered historically, and how could make us think about gender equality or reduced inequalities? Are there themes I can incorporate? And I don't think that gets too Soviet. I just think that's just screen dramatists and commissioners with huge budgets thinking, how can I do some good in the world? How can I contribute to us all trying to strive towards the SDGs?
I just want to bring in Danielle Goodman if she's still there, because Danielle asked a sort of related question, or made a related point, which was, I think, about the mix of people who are commissioning at Netflix. And Danielle, I just wondered what you were getting at there, and I'm going to then sort of bring it back to Michael and Gina in a moment.
Yes, I was wondering actually how representative are the commissioners themselves? You know, if the audience for Netflix spans gender, spans continents, spans countries, and classes, who are the commissioners? Do they similarly span that? What happens to producers and filmmakers from other parts of the world?
Yeah.
Content producers from Africa, for example. What's the process there?
And presumably one of the issues we've got is that, I don't know, Gina, whether you can help us answer the question there, but presumably we've got no details of that. Netflix is a private company. It doesn't tell you the mix of people making commissioning decisions, or does it?
It's public. It's publicly traded. So,
No,
but
sorry, a private company in the sense that it doesn't have to disclose that. It's not a publicly owned, as in like a BBC or a Channel 4. It doesn't have to disclose that level. Yeah.
Right. No. You know, those decisions, Lucas would actually be better than I am at answering that question, because I haven't covered their content creation for a pretty long time, but that's considered proprietary.
Yeah, I imagine it's Lucas. What's the answer to Danielle's point?
If we're talking about the executives who are commissioning projects, there's not a breakdown within that department, but Netflix has, like a lot of large technology firms in recent years, started to publish company-wide diversity data, both about sort of gender split and racial and ethnic diversity. I would say that it is, slightly better than your average technology firm, but certainly, below national or certainly international averages in terms of its, its workforce. But it doesn't break it out for that kind of the specific programming arm. There's also a lot of studies done by third parties and done by Hollywood unions looking at diversity in front of the camera, diversity behind the camera. There are new reports put out by a lot of different universities and think tanks that do break it down based on platform. Those tend to be more US focused. But yeah, there's more data, I think, than you would expect.
Well, Michael, can I come back to you? Let's talk just as we come towards the end of this, in terms of, if we've mapped out a little sense of what the politics of Netflix are like, and I suppose given ourselves some context for what we should or shouldn't worry about, how important it is, what would you do if you were in the position of a national government or a society trying to think about how best to handle Netflix? I know it's not the only streamer, but it's the most powerful one. What do you think should be done?
Stay away. I think that and anytime, you mentioned Stalinist earlier. Anytime the government gets involved in media, it never seems to turn out that well. And so I think that conservatives are on very shaky ground when they make an appeal to Ted Cruz to have hearings about Netflix, when Ted Cruz holds a nearly $1 million fund from Goldman Sachs and companies owned by the CCP. I'm a lot more concerned about that than him getting involved. I'm sorry, I was just going to say that ask your question, but I just want to make sure we all answer Phoebe's question, which is a great way to ground truth this. What is showing up in different people's, when they turn on Netflix, what is showing up on the top banner? What show are they really pushing? Because the data that we'll never know is is the distribution of the shows. They tell us what their top 10 is, but we don't realize, necessarily maybe 10% of the shows are driving 95% of the traffic. And I do think that the executives, of course, they don't get involved in everything. They can't at $19 billion a year, but they are definitely putting their finger on the scale in terms of what priorities are.
And let me just follow this through. So yes, we know that different shows show up in the banners for each of us, or actually not that different, but quite different. And we also know that there's a long tail of stuff that we never see, maybe kind of having a really big impact on the industry altogether. But do we as citizens have a reasonable right to expect that this information, these algorithms, are made public so we understand the distribution of information in society? Is that what you're saying, Michael?
No, I'm just saying we should always be suspicious. The less data that people release, the more we should be suspicious.
Right.
You know, at times when I've known people who've worked there, I know that The Office accounted for, 50% of the traffic, a licensed show that Netflix has. And I think back to, I like to think in terms of what can happen in the future. And I think of what Leni Riefenstahl did in Germany. And then what Winston Churchill said about Mrs. Minifer. This movie did more than a flotilla of British battleships. And if we can all accept the fact that media has an incredible impact on the way we view the world and the decisions that we make. And then finally, on your international question, it's interesting because when you look at the Middle East, I know that in Egypt and in other places, there's very strong pushback against any shows that feature, even have a gay and lesbian character in it. And at some point, I don't, call me cynical, I don't think there's any such thing as neutral. At some point, you do have to take a stand and say, well, we're sorry, but we're showing this, this is staying on our network.
Just one thing, Michael, about this, which is just a point that you made, and I suddenly come back to me. I was talking to someone in New York a few months ago who was saying something really interesting about the US studios, the streamers, and China on issues of sexuality and personal freedoms in film and storytelling, and whether or not the studios are being sort of pressed to pull back from presentation on identity and sexuality because the Chinese audience, or at least the Chinese government, doesn't want the Chinese audience to see that. And for the maths of a global hit to work, in effect, everyone has to be live according to kind of Chinese social values. Do you hear any of that in?
I've witnessed it, and it's odd that she is almost more transparent than Netflix, because he gave a speech saying we don't want any more girly girls in our television shows or films. It was a public statement that he made, and Quentin Tarantino was offered an incredible amount of money to change just a couple of scenes from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And to his great credit, he refused to do it. And China wouldn't air it, and the studio lost a lot of money. But, PEN, the fantastic organization that defends freedom of speech and writers, which is a left-leaning group, they've listed several dozen instances of films that will be coming out this year where the screenwriters substantially changed what is in the film. For example, the new Tom Cruise Top Gun movie, they digitally replaced any pictures of the Taiwanese flag and any reference to Taiwan.
Wow.
And now the paradox of all this is, if you look at the number of movies accepted into China, it continues to decrease. So they got Hollywood addicted, and now they're pulling back.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So there's a list of all of that. PEN keeps a list of all Chinese interference on scripts.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
the most glaring example was, over 10 years ago, they were rebooting Red Dawn, that cinematic classic.
Yes. I remember, but I was particularly interested in portrayal of gay characters in films, changes to family kind of dynamics, all that stuff. Anyway, it sounds to me as though as we, all kind of don our festive Oscar garb and think about how we celebrate the movies, maybe for Tortoise, the PEN list of studio interference is a good way for us to look at what's happening in the film industry. Okay, I'm going to come, if I might, just to finish this thinking with thoughts, if that's okay, from Lucas, Karen, and Gina. And I want to actually, because I got a little derailed, ask each of you whether you basically agree with Michael, which is governments, regulators, independent bodies stay away more or less people will make a sensible judgment on what they want from their screens. And, I'm not talking about incitement to hatred or, violent content, but overall entertainment platforms, let's leave well alone. Karen, do you take that view?
Well, I agree with Michael in that the culture that we watch is hugely impactful. It always has been. I mean, there's no way around that, and that can be really good or it can be really bad. But I think for a platform like Netflix, I agree also that there are certain things that you should be standing for, and they are making choices on those. But I would like to see more direct involvement in politics, really, that in their shows, in their dramas, because fictional representations of political and cultural issues can actually have more impact than documentaries sometimes, because we can engage with characters. And I just think they are missing a beat there in some senses. And I'd like to see more of it because it is elsewhere. And so, yeah, I think they're being very safe, personally.
Okay, Lucas.
I think almost nothing good can come from having a government try to tell an entertainment company or a news company what they can and can't do. I mean, especially if we're talking about is this massive TV network entertainment service political, the answer to that is going to be seen as yes. If you have government setting rules, it's going to get caught up in an incredibly polarized political moment right now. I just don't see the benefit from that.
Okay, Lucas, thank you. And Gina.
One thing that I always admired Netflix for when I covered them was that they were a platform where people could talk about a lot of issues. And if you think about it, they've been involved in almost every important social issue in the past 20 years. And like I said, some of that is because they were pretty desperate for content. But, if you think about some of the things that they've been dinged for, 13 Reasons Why, which was about teen suicide, The Messiah, which was accused of being anti-Muslim, First Temptation of Christ, which was a Brazilian show implying that Jesus was gay, Cuties, everybody knows about that one. So they've waded into all these issues, which I think is really a good thing, because it's a place for people to start talking about them. Now, on the other hand, Mike and I have had personal experience with them in terms of, we did a documentary about Netflix that they weren't too thrilled about, and we had a lot of trouble getting a distribution deal for it, just because people were terrified of them and were worried that they would be angry. We had the same issue with film festivals. The documentary did win Best Documentary in the film festival that we got it into, but they have an immense amount of power and implied power also. So I don't know if you can regulate that, but it's certainly something that needs to be watched to be sure that they just don't set the agenda for everything.
Mm-hmm. Gina, thank you. Okay, I would, if you haven't been to a thinking before, as like a news meeting, at the end, the editors try to go, okay, well, now that we've heard what you all think, here's what we actually think. And I'm afraid that I haven't come to the end of this with a sort of simple line of clarity, because it's complicated, and also I'm not sure that I agree with the general drift of the conversation, particularly around the relationship between society and streamers. And I want to sort of make the point why. I was totally persuaded by the first half, where in effect, Gina, I think you set the tone for it, which is, if 50 years ago the medium was the message, it feels as though in this decade the person is the platform. And the idea that the character of Sarandos, Randolph, and Hastings have so defined the politics, both in its kind of commercial instincts, but also in its kind of democratic friendships and its place in politics. That all makes sense to me. And I do think by your point, Michael, that it's sort of fundamentally green. I do understand that there's a kind of reactionary quality that I kind of embody that's, you know, responding to the new, and also Lucas's point that it is not organized to be kind of woke. There's a kind of no hive mind here. It's an expression of the culture, as Karen was pointing out, that it's in. All of that I buy. But if you think about where we ended up the conversation, which was at real concern that when you let the market set the terms of what happens in content, i.e. when China's buying muscle is starting to play with the script, that's an outcome that we really don't want. You have to ask yourself the question of whether or not you want to let the market decide in all its glory when it comes to the culture business. And I'm still one of those people who thinks that you want to have some kind of tension between the market, the audience, and the responsibility to society, the public square. And so I'm very wary of kind of pitching a version of kind of Jess's formula that makes people watch TV they don't want to see. But I do wonder whether or not you could take Jess's formula, the SDGs, or Danielle's point, which is about the people who make programs, and ask questions about inputs into streamers that would have an impact on what the outputs might be. And that might sound a little kind of broad, but I guess what I'm saying is it feels odd for me just to say, okay, listen, we're going to let what entertains most work. And I'll end with this final point. We had a conversation in our news meeting with Luke Bedimer, who's here, and Alexi Mostras, who write the Tech State Sense Maker. And they were talking about Facebook. And they were saying, if you look at the Facebook investment in metaverse, if you understand what's happening there, we are at the foothills of the attention economy. Right, all the money they made in Facebook and Insta and WhatsApp is now going into Meta, and we've not barely begun to understand what algorithms and Meta are going to mean in terms of the attention economy and how that changes our behavior. And if we can't get our arms around these platforms and this streaming, heaven help us with Meta. And so I suppose I'm reluctant to say, you know, let good commissioners do their work. But I don't have a perfect answer to what you do instead. So I will, in marking our own homework, I'll say, A, I failed completely on punctuality because Agatha, our tortoise, has burst through the finishing line. B, I don't come to you with a neat and freedom of expression defending proposition on regulation. But I hope that in this conversation and in the discussion in the chat, you feel as though we've got a little more granular thinking about the Netflix political agenda or agenda more generally. And for that, we really have to thank Karen, Michael, Lucas, and Gina. Thank you for your time this evening. We've learned a lot, thought a lot, and hopefully over the next few days, it'll all get clearer. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining. Come tomorrow evening, where we really are going to be talking about entertainment, British politics, 6:30 at our open news meeting. See you then.